Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jason Marzette, the director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. It's great to see so many friends, new friends, old friends for today's on the record event. Just a couple days after the end of the G20. This is actually also a lunchtime event. I know it's early for lunch. Someone was joking around that it could be as if you were having lunch in high school, eating so early. The Latin America Center, we usually serve lunch at 2 o'clock rather than 11 o'clock, but things are a little bit different today. If you're joining us from afar, you can tweet about today's event or in the room as well using the hashtag #ACChina. For those watching via webcast, we will be monitoring our accounts and trying to take your questions as well that you may tweet in. Let me just start off with a few thoughts. 2018 was an incredibly important year for global trade. The U.S. and China, in particular, started escalating rounds of tariffs and countervailing tariffs back in March. Trade conflict with repercussions for the entire world and long-term consequences for supply chains. There's also been a number of positive developments related to trade. After a year of negotiations, actually just over a year of negotiations, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada this past Friday signed the U.S. MCA. But the big question is, what about the role of China? And what about the role of China moving forward? As many of you know, China's trade with Latin America is up 20% this year from last year. And just last Thursday, China's Ministry of Commerce noted that China had become Latin America's second largest trading partner. This year, we'll also, for the first time in history, see Latin America becoming the preferred destination for Chinese overseas investment outside of Asia. And here at the Atlantic Council, we strive for always timeliness in trying to plan our events. It doesn't always work out. Today, it does happen to work out. And today, just 2 days after the highly successful meeting, I'll put that in quotes because that was exactly what was said on Saturday, between Presidents Trump and Xi, there has now been agreement to suspend additional tariffs for 90 days and to pursue talks. Of course, agreeing to talk is not reaching agreement, and plenty of sticking points do remain on the horizon. But at least now new tariffs will not be put in place, and President Trump has agreed that he will leave the tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese products at the 10% rate effect moving forward into the next 90 days. The implications, and I'll say of a potential thaw intentions, have effects beyond just the U.S. and China, as we will discuss today. And as Anabel González outlines in her incredibly timely report that we are launching today, titled Latin America Trade and Investment Amid Global Tensions, A Need to Upgrade and Diversify. And one of the things that Anabel will speak about during her report presentation are actually some of those scenarios for the U.S. and China moving forward, and also what are the implications for the region. We have a great agenda today. We're going to begin with opening remarks from our partner at HSBC, from Monica Macia, who is the Managing Director and Head of Loan Syndication for the Americas at HSBC. Monica will then introduce Anabel González, who is the former Minister of Trade for Costa Rica, and the report author, who we are delighted to have here today after many months of incredibly hard work to unpack this report's recommendations. Anabel also previously served as a senior director at the World Bank here in Washington. After Anabel speaks, I will then invite up a panel to a quick discussion for a G20 readout with Jeff Prescott, the Executive Director for National Security Action, also former Special Advisor for Asia and the Office of former Vice President Biden. And then, time permitting, we'll have a few questions before turning over to our second panel after we're caught up with the G20, which is where Anabel and I will also be joined by Frank Sassone, who's a Senior Vice President and Head of Treasury of the China Construction Bank, and also Aaron Ennis, who is a Senior Vice President at the U.S.-China Business Council. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for being with us here today. Before I hand things over to Monica, I'd like to also just take a moment to share a couple of thoughts with you on our Atlantic Council HSBC work and the paper we're launching today. For over 2 years, we have been carefully tracking Chinese engagement in Latin America here at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. And with engagement comes trade-offs. We've written on the implications of a globalized RMV for Latin America. We've debunked myths around China's role in Latin America's energy industry, and also analyzed the trends of Chinese FDI in Latin America. And without the generous support of HSBC, our work on China would not be as extensive. So thank you very much to HSBC. The report that we're also, one more note on the report we're launching today is something that all of us here are extremely proud of. This report is thoroughly researched, it's highly relevant, it fills a scholarship gap in one of the most important and least understood trading relationships in the global marketplace. It also, Anabel, as everything we try to do here, is incredibly forward-looking. It provides answers to questions that we are grappling with. It provides insights, it provides recommendations of keen interest to policymakers, diplomats, academia, business, and beyond. So thank you, Anabel, for your incredibly hard work and dedication. It's an honor to have worked with you and a pleasure that we're here today. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Monica Macia, Managing Director and Head of Loan Syndication for the Americas at HSBC, who will give a few comments and then introduce the report author, Anabel González. Monica, thank you so much for being here today.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you, Jason, for the introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here this morning for the launch of this timely report and really talk about timely, as mentioned. I guess we were all looking this weekend of what was going on in Argentina. It's looking at the China-Latin America trade and investment relationship and what lies ahead, and this is what you'll be hearing this morning. This report is part of a deeper look at China's growing role in Latin America that we at HSBC are proud to be doing in partnership with the Atlantic Council. As you might know, we at HSBC are really champions of global trade, and for over 100 years, HSBC has been at the forefront of globalization and connectivity. Jason, I want to echo your words and really welcome all of our guests and thank them for coming this morning. I speak for HSBC and our Chairman of Global Banking and Markets for the Americas, Gerardo Mato, when I say that we are proud of the work we have accomplished with the Atlantic Council in the area of China and Latin America over the past 2 years. The world's anticipation of the Trump-Xi trade talks this past weekend at the G20 point to the importance and influence of China today. For some time now, China has been an emerging superpower, rapidly expanding its influence beyond Asia, including into Latin America. But the question for us is, what does the Latin America-China trade and investment relationship look like amid global tensions? And of course, this is not coincidentally, this is the title of the report. The implications for Latin America of the US-China trade dispute have the potential to affect decades of economic growth and prosperity. I am confident that the report provides an important point of reference for thinking about the changing nature of the trade and investments dynamics between China and Latin America and understand the resulting implications. Latin America countries have already been impacted, as you've been probably reading, by the dispute, as recent Reuters article points out. Take Argentina, for example, one of the world's largest soybean exporter, as well as the largest exporter of processed meal and oil. But now Argentina is now one of the top importers of U.S. soybeans after U.S. soybeans prices fell 15% in the U.S. But the silver lining, and you always hear that there's a silver lining, is a crisis over opportunities. The premise of our report is that now is a time for Latin America to diversify its trading partners and exports. Chinese investment can help contribute to high-quality economic growth and spark innovation. Latin America and China have built strong ties for the past 2 decades. In fact, trade between the two regions has multiplied 18 times since 2000. China is today the largest trading partner for Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And as Jason just mentioned, China has become Latin America's second largest trading partner. Without a doubt, China's growing influence in the region, with its pros and its cons, cannot be understated. Chinese companies are moving rapidly into Latin America, and between 2005 and 2016, China invested an estimated $90 billion in the region. Traditionally, Chinese firms focus their investments in Latin America in the extractive sector, but a transition from reliance on natural resources to services and manufacturing will bring new opportunities to ensure a more prosperous future for the region. The report offers a series of recommendations, which you will hear from Anabel, that will help the region better benefit from the China-Latin America relationships moving forward. To hear those recommendations, I'd like to turn it over to Anabel González, author of this report. Anabel is a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Prior to this position, she was a senior director of the World Bank's Global Practice on Trade and Competitiveness, and previously served as Minister of Trade for Costa Rica. She's a global expert in economic development, focused on trade, investment, and competitiveness. Anabel, I look forward to your presentation and comments, please.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you, Jason, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and HSBC for the opportunity to prepare this report. So let me start by saying that current trade frictions between the U.S. and China do not bode well for Latin America. In confronted with potential scenarios of a full-fledged trade war, managed trade, or continued uncertainty, the region stands to lose from a return to a trading system in which power and politics, rather than market competition, allocate resources and inform business decisions. The motivation to explore new openings, strengthen partnerships, and redraw economic cooperation provides an opportunity, or provides, as Monica was saying, a silver lining to this gloomy scenario. And this, I think, is an opportunity for Latin America and China to explore fresh options to upgrade, diversify, and deepen their trade and investment relationship. So do we have the click? Oh, here it is. So first, some quick background. For the past almost 2 decades, Latin America and China have built a strong connection centered on trade, rising from a low 12 billion in the year 2000 to 224 billion in 2016. Bilateral trade has multiplied 18 times, and as has been said, China has become the region's second largest trading partner. Now, primary products and resource-based manufacturing account for more than 90% of Latin America's exports to China, while manufacturing dominates China's exports to the region. And 6 of China's main trading partners in Latin America are in resource-rich South America, where exports to China are concentrated in 4 products, which represent 75% of Latin America exports to China. These are copper, soybeans, crude oil, and iron ore. Mexico exhibits a different and more diversified pattern owing to both countries' participation in global value chains. Now, China's FDI in Latin America has also surged over the past decade. Between 2005 and 2016, China invested close to $90 billion in the region, representing some 5% of total FDI in Latin America, mostly on energy, utilities, and mining, though recently other sectors have increased in importance. Now, while rising trade and investment links have served both partners well, the high commodity concentration of the region's exports to China presents challenges and shortcomings, while potential opportunities remain untapped. So while current trade patterns will continue to anchor Latin-Sino trade and investment relations in the future, given factor endowments on both sides of the relationship, this report presents the idea that there are 3 areas of business opportunity that stand out for a broader trade and investment partnership. So leveraging the changing agricultural and food landscape in China to export more value-added and processed products is an opportunity for many Latin American countries, given their global competitiveness in many traditional and non-traditional agricultural products. And some producers in the region are already breaking ground. If you take Chile, for example, Chile has become the main source of cherry imports into China, with some 70% of the market in 2017, representing 80% of Chilean cherry exports. China has also become the #1 destination for Chilean wine. Only France and Australia export more wine to China. So, you know, when I have visited China several times, and sometimes when I meet people there, I say that I'm from Costa Rica, and they're like, so I say Latin America, and they say, oh yeah, Chilean wine. So now myself, I've also become an ambassador for Chilean wine in China every time I go there. But not all countries have been able to replicate China's success, among others, given that Latin America agricultural exporters face significant barriers in the Chinese market. And this include high tariffs, negative trade preferences from China's growing network of free trade agreements, non-discriminatory application of value-added tax exemptions, non-tariff barriers such as state trading, tariff rate quotas, and price controls, technical barriers, and sanitary and phytosanitary barriers. So improved access for Latin America agricultural exports to the Chinese markets would require from Latin America a number of steps. Document and measure trade barriers and negotiate their removal. And there's an excellent report by the Inter-American Development Bank precisely on these issues. Invest in market intelligence and monitoring of trade barriers. Strengthen export promotion plans to introduce, market, and position goods in the marketplace. Learn from and disseminate from positive regional experiences, and explore potential for collaboration across Latin American countries to develop a trade negotiations agenda to facilitate exports of processed agricultural goods. From the Chinese perspective, this would require a real and strong commitment to greater market openness and certainty, included through expedited and transparent mechanisms to issue sanitary and phytosanitary permits, reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to priority products in the context of negotiations, and build on Chinese e-commerce capabilities and regional experiences to support renewed export promotion initiatives to sell in the Chinese market. Now, a second area of opportunity is expanded trade in services with a focus on tourism. And tourism is recognized for its potential to spur job creation and regional economic development. And recently, tourism has performed well in China. Spending by Chinese tourists ranked first worldwide. And we also know that the industry has a solid base in several Latin American countries. Now, actions to leverage this opportunity from the Latin American side would require revising the policy framework to facilitate Chinese travel, for example, by expediting visa issuance, improving air connectivity with a view to increasing direct and especially nonstop flights, invest in market intelligence to further understand consumption trends, strengthen tourism promotional efforts to raise market awareness and develop brand recognition. Let me just say a quick word that it's not only tourism, but other services may present interesting opportunities. For example, business process outsourcing to support expansion of Chinese firms in the region. Now, on the part of China, unleashing tourism opportunities would require this improved air connectivity, leveraging the potential of Chinese airlines, and also collaborating with Latin American countries to raise market awareness and support Chinese outbound tourism, including through sharing best practices from other regions. The third area, going back, I think, well, in any case, the third area of opportunity is to foster e-commerce. And we know that China is a global powerhouse in e-commerce with 521 million online shoppers and an e-commerce market worth $3.4 trillion US. It holds close to 40% of the global e-commerce retail market. And cross-border online purchasing of imports has been growing steadily, with an estimated 25% of Chinese online buyers making a cross-border purchase in 2015. So Latin America would benefit from leveraging Chinese experience, providers, and marketplace to tap into the potential of e-commerce. Tmall Global and other specialized cross-border platforms like JD Worldwide, Sunning Global, and Amazon China Global Store host foreign sellers and also help manage currency issues. Now, to access the transformative potential of cross-border e-commerce with China, Latin America should contribute to the development of a framework to underpin e-commerce and reduce trade frictions in the WTO context. At the bilateral level, prioritize the design of rules to govern and facilitate digital trade, maximize domestic initiatives to facilitate e-commerce, including through an improved regulatory framework for e-payments and continued improvements on trade facilitation and logistics, and last but not least, develop specialized bound e-commerce export promotion strategies. On the side of China, China should also contribute to the development of this e-commerce framework in the context of the WTO, and at the bilateral level, prioritize the design of rules to govern and facilitate e-commerce. It would also be important for China to share with Latin America successful experiences in fostering e-commerce, for example, through new e-payment technologies, logistics hubs, like a recent one established in Malaysia to support digital commerce, and others. And finally, to develop a concerted effort with Latin American companies to bring Latin American firms to the market. In concluding, let me say that to realize these opportunities, policymakers should look to reshape a shared vision and modernize the institutional trade and investment framework to govern bilateral flows, including through the negotiation of free trade agreements, while addressing a number of supply-side constraints and aligning productivity-increasing reforms. Now, a deeper and upgraded Latin American-China partnership needs to be anchored in a context of a renovated and strengthened multilateral trading system. It cannot really substitute for it. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anabel. I applaud with not only your report, but how you were able to take such rich content from this and dissect it in I think just about 10 minutes. So thank you for that. I want to welcome Jeffrey Prescott. Jeffrey is the Executive Director for National Security Action and also Senior Fellow at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. Jeffrey joined the Obama administration in 2010 as a White House Fellow and was Vice President Biden's Deputy National Security Advisor and Special Advisor for Asian Affairs. Jeffrey, great to be here, and thank you so much for doing this today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for letting me join you on this incredible report.
What we're going to do is we're going to take 15 minutes here, given the timeliness of the G20, have a G20 readout discussion before we then transition to a broader panel that looks even more in depth at your report, Anabel. Jeffrey, let me start off with you. Over the weekend, President Trump and President Xi, they met in Argentina, the G20. A lot of different readouts of what their implications of their meeting and the dinner. President Trump has had his own tweets and there are statements from the Chinese as well. What is your quick summary of the meeting's implications and the results that we saw over the weekend?
Sure. Well, I think you put it quite right at the introduction that really there's a truce here that has come out of this meeting, and essentially the United States and China have agreed, at least for the moment, to step back from the brink of further deepening the trade war that I think it's fair to say we're already in, by the U.S. agreeing not to increase the tariffs or add new tariffs, and China agreeing to some kind of unspecified additional purchases of U.S. materials or other steps that they'll take. You're right to point to the different stories coming out of the G20 meetings, and obviously it's only been 24 hours or so, but if you line up side by side, and a number of news organizations, Bloomberg among them, have done this, if you line up side by side the statements that have come from the United States and from China on what exactly was agreed in this meeting, they're really ships passing in the night. And I think that raises a lot of questions. Now, it's not unusual for both sides after a diplomatic negotiation to try to put the most favorable light on what has come out of that. I think the challenge is that we've seen a number of times with this administration, very different stories between the United States and foreign counterparts on what exactly has been agreed. And in fact, in the North Korea context, we're still negotiating about what was decided at the Singapore summit. So The real question is whether there's any breakthrough, if there's really any real agreement in detail that has been reached, or if everyone has decided to pause, take the foot off the gas on the tariff side, and come back to talks over the course of the next 90 days.
A pause could be a breakthrough.
It could be, although I think it's fair to say that none of the reporting suggests we've gotten really any progress on the main structural issues that the U.S. and China have been tussling over as part of this negotiation. So if you look at the issues the U.S. really cares about in terms of state-owned enterprises, in terms of forced technology transfer, in terms of IP, in terms of other restrictions on the Chinese market, there's no substance coming out of this meeting, and it's not clear that anything has shifted over the weekend that would make the talks over the next 90 days any easier. And I think that raises the same kind of questions that Anabel has put in this report in terms of what are the opportunities for other countries, including those in Latin America, to navigate what is clear to be a fairly tense period in U.S.-China relations.
Well, Anabel, I'll let you describe your report rather than myself, but one of the things that you do talk about in the report is you outline 3 different scenarios for the future of China-Latin America trade, and thereby the implications as well for Latin America. You mentioned that in your opening presentation that the trade spat between the two countries does not bode well for Latin America. Maybe there are some short-term opportunities, but overall it doesn't bode well. Take us through, do you agree with Jeffrey's readout over the weekend, and also what do you see as the implications for Latin America?
Thank you very much, Jason. I do think that Jeffrey's points are exactly right as to what happened or what are the implications of some of those conversations. In the report, we basically talk about 3 scenarios. One is a potential full-blown trade war, which we're not there yet, but tariffs still continue to be part of the discussion, either as instruments to promote negotiations or as objectives in themselves, which is something that we still don't know, or I still don't know. The second scenario is that of managed trade, where a grand deal, a grand bargain is entered into. And I think that there is a component of that in the discussions that we saw in the G20, in the sense that there seems to be an indication that China will be buying still an unspecified amount, but a substantial amount, according to some of the reports, of agricultural, energy, and industrial products from the U.S. And the third scenario that it's outlined in the report is more like the uncertainty continues. There is no real sort of we still have the WTO, but its provisions are weakened, and the respect for the rules is weakened. And I think that we keep sort of jumping from one scenario to the other, and we see sort of like bits and pieces of each of the scenarios. Now, the point that I made is that none of this is good for Latin America, in the sense that, some people at some point got excited and said, more Brazilian soybeans into the Chinese market. This is going to be great for Brazil. Well, not really, because yes, Brazil has sold a lot of soybeans this year, but if there is an agreement that China will buy more U.S. soybeans next year, then, for Brazil, that didn't really mean anything, because there cannot be any sort of investment decisions based on this sort of fluctuating cases. And I have a friend of mine, the director of Brazil to the Inter-American Development Bank here, Jose Reis, and this is something that we have discussed before. Uncertainty for investors does not bode well.
So of those 3 scenarios, which, if you had to put your money on one right now, where would you put your money?
I would put, my bets in all 3 of them. At this point, I don't think that I can,
Let me before I turn it back over to Jeff, I want to give the audience audience thoughts. Raise your hand. Uncertainty continues. Who thinks that's okay? Managed trade. Couple. Full-blown trade war. Nobody. Okay, so the audience here thinks the very scientific informal poll we just did, that uncertainty will continue. If that uncertainty continues, Jeffrey, what are the implications for Washington? What does this mean for the U.S. relationship with China if that uncertainty continues?
Well, I think the uncertainty to some extent is part of the game plan for the Trump administration. I think the approach here has been to create a level of uncertainty and try to generate some leverage from that. The question is whether the administration can turn that into something concrete at the end of the day. And here I guess I would make two generic points. One is that there's a real disconnect between what the U.S. is looking for from China and what it can deliver in terms that will translate into what is soon to be an all-out political cycle here in the United States. The things the U.S. really cares about are these structural issues in the U.S.-China economic relationship, some of the same concerns that countries in Latin America may have about China as well. And the reality is even a grand bargain that Trump could reach that addressed some of those in a meaningful way, which I think is a real question mark, even if that were to be achieved, you wouldn't see the results of that until they were implemented. And we know from long experience that on these issues, you're talking about a very difficult process of incremental progress. That's very hard and very hard to turn into a flashy campaign slogan or a real quick win, which I think is why purchases, for example, is one way you go. The second point I'd make is that also relates to the politics of this. I think we're going to be entering a very complicated period in the U.S. In terms of the pressures on the Trump administration, whether it come from the legal troubles, the oversight agenda that the change in the Congress will have. And I think this will put a lot of pressure on the Trump administration to try to figure out where does it want to be with China in 2020? Does it want to have a big deal that it can try to run on in the next presidential election? Or does it want China as a competitor and an enemy that it can point to try to explain away why some of the structural changes in the U.S. haven't matched the rhetoric that we've had in terms of the campaign trail? So I think those two factors are going to be very significant in terms of how the administration approaches this negotiation and the larger relationship.
Where do you think, of those two scenarios, where do you see the administration potentially going?
Well, I think wherever the politics leads them, frankly, because that ultimately is where I think the motivation for some of this is coming from. It happens to be attached to some very long-standing concerns, but the ability to start a fire and then put it out and take advantage of the temporary bump that comes from that is something we've seen in other areas from this administration.
Mm-hmm. Anabel, I want to go back to the G20 for a second. There have been a number of questions about the value of multilateralism and how effective multilateralism is in the age in which we're in. From your perspective, how is the G20 Summit, how has that helped to reshape that narrative, establish confidence in multilateral institutions? There was a rather robust G20 declaration, at least 8 pages that came out. Do you see this as being a watershed moment to reestablishing the importance of multilateralism?
Well, a good thing was that we got a paragraph on trade in the declaration. Paragraph 27 is there. And it makes some important points. One is a recognition that trade is an important engine for growth, for innovation, for jobs, and that's very positive. And that multilateralism has contributed to this. It also makes the point that the WTO needs to be reformed, and members commit themselves to the reform of the organization. So my understanding is that it was sort of like a hardly fought outcome, but from my perspective, the fact that it mentions that countries will support and will work to achieve WTO reform is an important thing. Now, this is sort of like, of course, a political backing to the reform efforts that will need to take place in Geneva and capitals, and that have already begun with the presentation of a number of proposals to reform. But at least, there is, I think, this moment. In previous gatherings, as we know, APEC just a couple of weeks before, it was not possible to have a paragraph on trade. So from that perspective, this is an improvement. But then again, our bar has gotten a bit low, if I may, right. But at least it's there.
At least it's there. Jeff, let me turn to you on the last question before inviting up the next panel, keying off of what Anabel mentioned on the trade paragraph. This declaration also didn't include anything about protectionism, which is very notable. But what does the next chapter of global trade look like amid this at least temporary relaxation in U.S.-China tensions?
Well, I think this administration has put an enormous bet on the value of bilateral negotiations as a way of going about securing our economic interests. And so it's not just that these tensions with China have risen during the course of the last couple of years. We're also taking on Europe. We took on Canada, Mexico. It's really been an approach across the board. And I think one of the real questions will be, to what extent do countries around the world decide to try to wait to see the outcome of the next political cycle in the United States and see if there's an opportunity to recommit to getting together with our friends, getting together with the vast majority of the U.S., of the global economic and trade environment, and try to come together around a set of rules that we know need to be updated to address all of these concerns that we have, both on the tech side, on the protectionism side. And that's an open opportunity, but I think one that is going to be a little further down the road.
Well, thank you. It's never easy to dissect the outcomes of a meeting after slightly over 24, 36 hours. It's as if you had a week to actually digest everything. So thank you very much, Anabel, Jeffrey, for this very good analysis of the outcomes over the weekend. I want to ask Anabel to stay on stage and the rest of the panelists to come up for the second panel. But please join me in thanking Jeff and Anabel for this great discussion. Thank you, Jeff. Welcome to the stage Adrienne Ennis and Frank Sassone. Adrienne is the Senior Vice President at the U.S.-China Business Council, where she directs their government affairs and advocacy work for member companies and also oversees their business advisory services. Prior to that, Adrienne worked at McClarty Associates, implementing strategies for international business clients on proprietary trade matters. Adrienne is also a return speaker at the Atlantic Council, specifically at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. So thank you again, Adrienne, for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Frank Sassone. Frank is this is the first time we've gotten you to come down from New York. Frank is the head of Treasury and Senior Vice President of China Construction Bank's New York branch. Prior to joining CCB, he was treasurer for U.S. operations at Dexia, a European banking group, and also treasurer for U.S. operations at the National Bank of Kuwait. For those of you who are unfamiliar with China Construction Bank, it's one of the known as one of the four big banks of China. So to you, Frank, and Adrienne, very much for joining this discussion. What we're going to do is we're going to look specifically at some of the broader outlines of the China-Latin America relationship, and then we'll dive specifically into the future, not only the business opportunities that Anabel discussed, but also the future trajectory of the relationship, and then also think more broadly about what a win-win solution, what a win-win opportunity is for China-Latin America relationship moving forward. Adrienne, I'll start with you. Your quick take on the Trump-Xi meeting and the outcomes. We were just discussing this with Jeffrey and Anabel. Do you agree with the preceding panel's comments, and what else would you like to add to that?
I do agree. I think that what we saw come out of those meetings is probably the best case scenario of what could have come out, an agreement to not escalate. But it's hard to escape the fact that we still got $267 billion worth of tariffs on imports into the United States from China, and China has retaliatory tariffs on about 85% of U.S. exports at this point. So what we will be looking for in the U.S. business community is the fine details of not only whether they can come to agreement on those structural issues that Jeff mentioned and that we very much care about market access and how companies are treated in the market, but also what's the plan to get rid of those tariffs. I mean, these all have a distorting effect. And to Anabel's point, if the tariffs are the point, then we need to know that as well.
Yeah. Now, Frank, Anabel in her presentation, you put up a PowerPoint slide there, Anabel, with 6 different countries, and noticed that one of those key aspects there was the fact that a lot of that trade has been focused very much on natural resources over the course, except for Mexico, right? Mexico, where a lot of that commercial relationship is in the other category. Frank, from 2006 to 2016, the China-Latin America trade grew 200%, a pretty staggering number. And this relationship has been highly transactional in many regards, and this has also helped to be a fundamental for driving China's robust economic growth over the past 2 decades and providing those key natural resources for China. Since that first period, since 2006, how have China's population and also their consumer needs changed in the last decade or so? And what are the implications of that moving forward for Latin America?
So as far as China's opening up, right? It's part of, and I think China Construction Bank. First of all, thank you for having me.
Great to have you. Thank you.
And it's good to be a first timer. But I think
be careful, we'll invite you back too.
Okay. I'm going to disagree with everything you say. No, what's important to know, for example, with the consumer is the Chinese banking system understands that China's committed to global growth. I think that the Big Four, China Construction Bank, is part of that, understanding the global growth and is committed to growing globally. As we've seen in Latin America, for example, CCB has opened an operation, a branch in Chile, which happens to be a CNH clearing, a new CNH clearing hub. It's also opened up or purchased a bank in big bank in Brazil. So I think it's consistent with the Chinese banking system understanding the needs, as you say, of the consumer, and the part of our global plan to participate in that activity.
Anabel, what are the implications of that? What are the implications, Frank is describing China Construction Bank's opening up of new operations across the certain countries in the hemisphere? What are the implications of that for commerce and for investment between Latin America and China?
Well, I think having a strong sort of financial banking system that can underpin further trade and investment relations between China and Latin America is a very welcome step, and it is critical to actually leverage some of the opportunities that were mentioned there. So I think that's very, very significant. I think also the other part that is very significant, aside from sort of like the specific points that I mentioned to leverage each of the opportunities, is a bit of a change in a mindset, and is how can countries, certainly how can Latin America, take sort of like a more active role in shaping the relationship with China. And it is clear that the concentration on commodities responds, as I said, to factor endowments, to demand and supply dynamics in the region, but there is still much more that can be done. And if you think about Latin America in terms of the, for instance, agricultural sector, supplies about a quarter of China's inputs, but again, highly concentrated in some of its products, not a lot of processing happening in the region, whereas the region has been able to make progress in selling to other markets more processed goods. Yeah. So this suggests that there is a potential for Latin America to also tap into the Chinese market if some of these barriers are reduced.
That's a great point. Well, this is a great segue into a conversation on the investment and the business opportunities that exist between China and Latin America. Aaron, let me go back to you. In recent years, there's been differing opinions around the China model versus the U.S. model for foreign investment. Both have their significant differences, and there's also a number of questions about whether U.S. investment can, frankly, match that of China. Whether there are the resources to be able to do that. What are the different alternatives for Latin American governments, given those two different investment models, and how do those two different investment models play out in Latin America as they would play out in other parts of the world?
Well, before we sat down, we talked a little bit about kind of some of the perceptions on it. From a business standpoint, I think it's important to keep in mind that companies are certainly never going to turn away an opportunity for governments to pay for better infrastructure and to create a model that allows them to do better business in those areas. And so for Latin America in particular, I don't think that they should be turning away investment opportunities from US or China. It really doesn't make any difference if it's improving what the overall business environment is. From a specific standpoint in terms of kind of where Latin America positions itself, I think it's an interesting point to keep in mind that The issues that Latin American companies face doing business in China are no different than the issues that American companies face in the market, with the notable exception of the fact that obviously there is a heightened tension about American products in the market at this point. But finding ways to work together both as a region, as Anabel proposes, but also with other trading partners to improve the business climate in China and to set the terms of how outbound investment, not just from China, but from the United States and others, are treated, and ensuring that investors get equal treatment around the world. Those are things that we all have a mutual interest in, and then finding ways to either reform the WTO to address those things or to find a network of agreements to do that and achieve the same goal really is where we all should be focused.
Yeah. May I just
please
make two quick points. One is that I like to use the example of my own country, Costa Rica, in saying how all this can actually work very well for investors from the different places and for the host country, of course. So a European company has been awarded a very large contract to build a new port container terminal in Costa Rica. Mm-hmm. A Chinese company is building the road that will lead to that new container port terminal. And the major beneficiaries of that road will be the U.S. and Costa Rican companies, U.S. companies in the medical devices sector, and Costa Rican companies, for instance, in agri-food products. Yeah. So all this comes together very well for a particular country. And the second point that I wanted to make was building on Aaron's comment that this is why, attempting at resolving some of the issues at bilateral level is important, but it is also very relevant to go to the WTO, because that gives the opportunity to bring in all of those countries that can actually do have a stake in having, reform take place either in China or in some of the agreements in the WTO.
And let Frank jump in too.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, you mentioned infrastructure, but if we think about banking is really the platform for which corporations and governments can actually financial intermediary and transact. And one of the things that China is doing, which are maybe the audience is familiar or not familiar, there actually are two currencies in China. There's an onshore and an offshore. And as a consequence, it's been very challenging for, whether it be in the United States or in other countries, to really fully participate in trade in probably the most efficient way which they can, which would be trading in the home currency of the RMB. So we have launched, there's new RMB clearing hubs in both Chile and Argentina. But I think the true success is going to begin now, because the U.S. with the RMB Working Group has just announced, in cooperation with the Treasury and the Fed and the PBOC, that we're launching a clearing hub in the U.S. And why is that important is because it increases liquidity, it changes the time zone, and also be significant cost savings and help facilitate trade with Latin American partners. Why is it really important for Latin America? Is because, similar to for the US, we need liquidity from Hong Kong and then from London, and now you are going to get liquidity from New York. So when this happens, it'll be another positive step to the financial intermediation, which will definitely help the corporates. The one comment that I also would make about the financial services is that it's opening up. I mean, they're opening up in China. Hong Kong Shanghai Bank now can be a majority JV. UBS was just approved the other day. JP Morgan is been approved is in the process of being approved. So as China opens up, there should be more and more opportunities, not only for global but also for Latin American banks.
Frank, we did a report here about a year ago with HSBC called Globalize Remit RMB. What are the implications for Latin America? And specifically looked at the growth of clearinghouses across the region. How this is so fundamental for exacting those direct transactions and facilitating those business opportunities.
Well, it's like the Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams. Build it and they will come. Right. So we are the clearing hub in London, and the clearing hub in CCB is the clearing hub for CNH in London, and it has just been the hockey stick, and it's significant growth. In addition to facilitating payments, you now have futures and options that are highly active in the UK, and you have bond issuance in RMB. So it is a full financial structure that is very possible.
Yeah. Reinforcing also Anabel and Aaron's point, which is what we always try to do here, is look at the China-Latin America relationship, not in black and white terms, but really try to provide that nuanced, gray perspective in the middle of what the implications of the region. I think, as both of you are just commenting, that the Chinese investment in the region can be a win for the United States as well. It's not necessarily a win-lose relationship, specifically that model you were just pointing out there in Costa Rica, Anabel. Let me also turn back, Anabel, you lay out a couple different business opportunities in the report. What do you see as some of the policies that Latin American governments should enact to ensure that the FDI that's coming in from China really translates into benefits that are sustainable and that provide inclusive long-term growth, right? Because that's one of the key questions is the degree to which Chinese investment really is providing that sustainable long-term opportunities for the region. And at the same time, that's complementary, I would say, to the investment opportunities that could come from domestic industries in the region.
Well, I think, if you look at Latin America in general, most countries in the region have, great needs in the area of infrastructure. So I would continue to say that infrastructure will be an important part of the investment in Latin America. And there is this, of course, a lot of discussion associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, but most recently, a number of Latin American countries, I think by now it's about maybe 9 or 10, have somehow become involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are some important infrastructure projects in the region that are being financed by the Chinese. And I think that we will continue to see more of that. Now, there is also opportunity for Chinese investment coming into the region in other areas. And we have been seeing that in terms of a number of Chinese mergers and acquisitions in a number of countries. Very interestingly, venture capital, for example, also coming into the region. Recently, Didi, a platform similar to Uber in China, bought 99, a large Brazilian firm as well. And I think from that perspective, there will also be a number of new opportunities that we could see Chinese investment.
Aaron, let me turn to you before going to Frank from a Chinese perspective. But as Anabel is outlining from your perspective and facilitating commercial opportunities for the United States with China, what's your advice for Latin American businesses that are looking to expand, deepen their trade and investment with China, and also do it in a way that, as Anabel was saying, that really provides that value added, right? That this is one of the keys in your 3 points is really is, whether it's agricultural products or others, really that higher value of the exports to China. What's your advice from the U.S.? What's worked from the U.S. company perspective?
Well, I think it's a combination of both looking at what has worked not just for the United States and China's other trading partners, but also where China has prioritized. I was pleased to see that Anabel had included e-commerce as an area, because this is not just one that everybody in China seems to be buying things on their phones, but at the same time, it's an area that China has prioritized. They just announced in mid-November a plan to extend a pilot program that they have that is facilitating not just cross-border trade in electronic commerce, but to lower the tariffs on the products that are brought in, streamline the regulatory approvals that are necessary for first-time importers. Those are the kinds of advantages that Latin American companies can definitely take advantage of, and it aligns nicely with where China is going. And when these pilot programs are proven a success, China's policies are in line with what foreign companies are willing to sell, it meets all of the criteria, those are the kind of policies that need to be taken from being just a pilot program into permanent policies that will lock in then those benefits long term.
That's great, Aaron. And Frank, from the Chinese perspective, what do you see as some of the policies that could be facilitated with some of the low-hanging fruit that can provide greater commercial opportunities between both China and I say Latin America, but I say specifically the major countries in the region that are already engaged in commercial investment relationship with China?
Well, from my personal experience, I think that China is looking for opportunities to grow in those that are the most safe, prudently safe, consistent with their objectives and goals. So, China is looking to grow globally, and it's looking to grow conservatively. China is people might not realize it, but the Chinese banks are very conservative. China is a very conservative in its nature country.
Now let's turn to the future trajectory of the relationship. Anabel, the evidence suggests that increased trade between China and Latin America could lead to a regional shift toward China as the preferential partner moving forward. And China's already, as you mentioned in your report in the slide, China's already the largest trading partner for Argentina, for China, for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Brazil. The president-elect has had a number of comments about that relationship. How can Latin America navigate the competing U.S.-China foreign policy interests so that you can capitalize on the opportunities with both actors, right? Because in Washington here, from the administration, it's still seen as very much a win-lose relationship, right? So how do you were mentioning the Costa Rica example, but what else can be done from some of those key countries to really be able to capitalize on opportunities both with China as well as with the United States?
Well, one thing that I would say is that I don't think that this is an either or kind of situation. That the needs in Latin America are huge, and I think that China, the U.S., and certainly Europe, and and other places in the world can bring. Can make significant contributions to Latin America in terms of investment. There are opportunities to increase investment coming from all regions in the world, and those investments can be complementary. There are a number of trade opportunities, that can also benefit investors from the U.S. coming into China. I think that, from my perspective, I see that most recently, sort of like the geopolitical, geosecurity angle is sort of permeating the vision of the China-Latin America relations. And while acknowledging that there may be something of that, I would like to also bring the spotlight into the business opportunities that actually are there for everyone to benefit from.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And Frank, we also see that non-traditional sectors, manufacturing, services, are playing an increasing role in Chinese investment in Latin America. Looking back, but also looking ahead, how has Chinese outbound investment evolved in the region, and also what are some of the trends that you see moving forward?
Well, I think you bring up a great question, because the China growth, the China miracle over the past 20 years has been based on a manufacturing society. Mm-hmm. And consistent with China's goals, they want to transform that from a manufacturing society to a service society, and as a consequence, bring up the GDP. There's a process of urbanization to reflect that. So I think the target going forward will be more of the service sector, and I think that's where, whether it's in Latin America or in the U.S., that's where we see more of the opportunity, more of the investment. Both the outbound investment and hopefully the inbound investment will be towards the services. But we see a lot of specifically that trend from manufacturing to services.
Aaron, what are the implications of that for the United States, for U.S. business?
Well, I mean, we have a very strong services economy, so certainly a movement towards having China's market more open to services would benefit U.S. companies equally. And frankly, part of the reason why China is viewed as a largely manufacturing economy is a sign of the successes of the openings that they put in place when China joined the World Trade Organization. There were very few restrictions on full foreign ownership in manufacturing, and here we are, working on 20 years later. China is clearly a global leader in manufacturing. Competition would do the same in services, and it's not a matter of whether it is an American company, a Chinese company, or a Latin or European company that gets a slice of the pie. This is literally an instance of growing the pie, because between what happens in financial services for creating wealth, or the opportunities for express delivery. These are the kinds of things that facilitate much broader growth, and it's ones that American companies will benefit from and everyone else.
I have a few more questions, then I'll open it up to the audience for all of your questions. So start to think of what those might be. Anabel, I have a really key question for you. We speak a lot about the need for Latin America to diversify its exports. Specifically in the China context, but in a lot of different contexts. Walk us through a little bit. What does that actually mean in practice, and how could that actually be achieved? Especially, you lay out a lot of different recommendations in your business opportunities, but how do we actually get to those? How do we actually get to the implementation of some of those recommendations, specifically around diversification of exports to China?
Well, you know, I don't want to overplay my Costa Rican card, but I want to say, I mean, I need to.
You're entitled.
You're entitled. No, but I think it's an interesting story. This was a country that some 25 years ago exported 4 products to the world: coffee, bananas, sugar, and beef. And today it exports 4,500 different products to 150 countries all over the world. Now, you know, this is a significant process of structural transformation that took place via a number of policies that the country implemented over time on a consistent basis. So if you look at attracting investment is a key component of structural transformation for developing countries. So, you know, what type of investment? You know, you start with some type of investment and you move up the ladder. So it's a country that now, product number 1 of exports is medical devices. Would you have thought that that would have been the case 30 years ago? No. So it is true that for a number of countries in Latin America, but particularly in South America, these are countries that are very resource rich. But that doesn't mean that products need to be exported in their primary, you know, without any further processing. Actually, a number of those countries are already very successful in exporting processed products, for instance, to the European market. So there's an opportunity to go there as well. A number of these countries also are very successful. They're beginning to be very successful in the services area. Now, the question, I think, for Latin America is more, there was a very interesting McKinsey report a couple of years ago looking into growth opportunities for Latin America in the future. And they said Latin America needs to move from a commodity mindset to a productivity mindset. And I think that is really the challenge. And that is vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the US, vis-a-vis Latin America itself.
Let me just drill down a little bit. Where do you, beyond Costa Rica, where do you see some of those greatest opportunities? Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru. China is the largest trading partner for all 4 of the. How do they take one example of how you can actually specifically move toward that greater diversification?
Well, I'll take the case of Chile because I really think that this is a wonderful case. It's not only this story about the wine that I mentioned, but if you look at exports of fruits coming out of Chile, I mean, they are growing significantly every year. I mentioned the case of cherries, where Chile, a country that has 17 million people, now supplies 70%, 70, of the imports that China does of cherries. And China loves cherries, by the way. So, you know.
Especially Chilean cherries, I guess.
Yeah. That seems to be the case. Yeah. But that also applies to a number of other products, apricots, pears. But this has not happened by accident. Chile has taken a very deliberate effort and put in place a number of measures. Like they have, for instance, their former President Eduardo Frei is an ambassador at large to promote Chilean products in China. And he has played a very significant role in doing this. They also have the institutional support. They have 4 or 5 different offices of ProChile, their investment promotion, their export promotion agency sitting there. They also have marketing plans that they put in place every year. So, you know, and they've also leveraged the free trade agreement between Chile and China, the first one in Latin America, to actually use that as a way of expediting the sanitary and phytosanitary permits that are very complicated to get in China. So from that perspective, I think that Chile has shown that it is possible if you put in place policies, you know, to actually change the composition of your exports to a particular market. Now, will that mean that Chile will not export copper to China? No, Chile will continue to export copper to China, but all these other products will also help diversify that trade.
Erin, did I see you mentioning, putting your hand up to jump in here?
No, but I'd be happy to jump in. I mean, I think everything that Anabel has said makes sense. I mean, I think the other thing to keep in mind is China is, I don't think has a similar approach the United States does in terms of seeking out a bilateral approach to everything. But China certainly has made clear that it's interested in bilateral agreements with governments around the world. In looking at it, we've got, I think it's 6 trading partners the United States already has a free trade agreement with, that China has a free trade agreement with, and it's in the process of negotiating 5 or 6 more. To the extent that negotiating the rules that make it profitable for a country to consider China, or more predictable for a country to consider China a bigger market, that's also another avenue that should be kept in mind.
Now, Frank, one of the recommendations of the report is for China to commit to greater market openness and also certainty regarding, as Anabel and Aaron are describing, certainty regarding food and agricultural products from Latin America, whether it's cherries, whether it's wine. What reforms are needed for this to happen from the Chinese perspective? How does what needs to be done? What can be done to provide for that for more of these types of examples of key Latin American products to enter into the Chinese market?
Well, I think it's consistent with China continuing to open up. I mean, that's the key.
Yeah. So
they continue to open up. One of the interesting articles I just read recently was that China has announced that they will be adopting competitive neutrality in their SOEs, which is a big, complicated. As people that understand China, you have your SOEs that really dominate, and the idea is there's an unlevel playing field with the rest of the world. And they just announced that they're going to look into a strategic objective of adopting the OECD competitive neutrality. I think this is
explain a little bit what that means.
So in China, you have the largest 50 institutions. Competitive neutrality is that private sector will have the same, the state-owned or government-owned entities will not have an advantage over private sector. And I think that if there's any country that probably has the benefit of that, would be China, and China's enjoyed that for many years. I think part of opening up is that, and I think that the Chinese government just announced that they're looking into that strategic objective. So I think consistent with opening up, whether it be neutrality or competitive neutrality, or opening in the financial markets, which I think is a really big step forward, which I don't think gets enough press today, that China is actually opening up and enabling securities firms to come in and finally be majority owners. Mm-hmm. It might take a little longer than people anticipate, but I can tell you, like the HSBCs of the world, the JPMs and the UBS are smart in getting in there. You know, there's a 1.4 billion consumers, 1.4 billion that are going to have an amazing amount of resources and savings. That is a tremendous opportunity. So, just in general, I hope I didn't go too broadly, but opening up is what is consistent with what's going to happen.
So I want to make sure that we have, I'm sure there's plenty of questions from the audience. If not, don't fear, I have plenty more questions myself. So please raise your hands. I'll take Jose in the first row there, and the microphone will come over to you here. It's coming to you. If you could just state your name and affiliation, please.
Thank you. I'm Jose Reis, director at the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank. Great presentation, great panel. Thanks, both panels. One question to Anabel, and perhaps Erin and Frank could comment as well. In the report, you mentioned also the possibility of FTAs signed with China as something that could benefit from this opening up of the Chinese economy and really make sure that some of the changes that you suggest take place. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this? Costa Rica, I guess under your leadership, signed a free trade agreement with China. What are the challenges for Latin American countries to do this?
Thanks, Jose. And actually, given the number of questions, I'm going to take the question right behind you as well at the same time.
Hi, I'm Barbara Stallings from Brown University and also Schwarzman Program at Tsinghua University in Beijing. There's an elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned. I'm wondering if anyone has any insights in what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months in Brazil with the Bolsonaro government and its declared concern, let's say, about Chinese investment and trade with that country. Do you think that he's actually going to follow up on any of these, or is he going to pull a Macri and sort of look around and then pull back? And if he does try and restrict Chinese investment and or trade, what impact is that likely to have elsewhere in the region? Is that likely to scare off the Chinese, or they just say, okay, we'll forget our biggest partner and go with other countries?
Thanks for that question. Maybe we could have switched the order, but then Jose, you would have had to.
I can hit that bilaterally.
Exactly. So both possibility of FTAs, lessons learned, specifically Anabel as well from your time as trade minister with Costa Rica, and then also the question of Bolsonaro and what actions he will take with regard to China and the implication of that.
Well, I think for Latin American countries in the current context, aiming at certainty with their trading partners is very relevant. That certainty can be achieved in the WTO in a number of areas, but it is also important to look at bilateral agreements that could further help solidify that trade relationship. China has three free trade agreements in the region, one with Chile, which was the first one, second one with Peru. Both of them are being revised right now to update them and to modernize them, and a third one with Costa Rica. At several points in time, China has expressed its interest to negotiate agreements with other countries in the region. And I continue to think that this could be a very important instrument in fostering the relations. There is a number of research that shows that preferential trade agreements, particularly when they are deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, can actually have a very positive benefit in terms of increasing productivity, increasing exports, et cetera, for the countries that are part of this agreement. So that's one reason. But also, I do think that this, and in the way in which China works, these agreements are very relevant to facilitate some of the other permits and authorizations that I was mentioning before. I think a negotiation of free trade agreements would allow Latin American countries to actually, tackle some of these barriers that I've been mentioning that impede Latin American exports to the region. Now, Panama is negotiating an agreement right now. And if you look, for instance, at the Pacific Alliance, you have Chile and Peru already having agreements. Well, there would be an opportunity for Mexico and Colombia to look into this. Likewise, in Mercosur countries, that may be an opportunity. Now, let me just maybe say a brief comment here that I think it is still too early to say what will come in Brazil. I think that the presence of Chinese firms in Brazil is quite significant, and it has become very relevant, very important in a number of sectors in the Brazilian economy. So I think that we will need to wait and see. At least my approach would be to wait and see a little bit more about that. But I have the impression that China can also master complex environments. China is in Venezuela at the end of the day. So that shows that there is, some higher risk sort of appetite or whatever you want to call it.
If I could just add in on the question about free trade agreements, I mean, I think the main thing to keep in mind in this is that the details of these agreements matter. Locking in existing practices might give you some certainty about what you're dealing with, but it doesn't do much to advance the interests of your country's companies. So the key here is to build on those free trade agreements that China has already negotiated and that any of the other governments are participating in, and take it to the highest level that you possibly can. Prior to the U.S. pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, China was actually talking about its interest in potentially at some point joining TPP. That's right. That's where we should be pushing these kinds of agreements, so that it's not just a patchwork of individual agreements where companies from individual countries can benefit from it, but instead we're raising the standard so that each time a government has an FTA, that it's improving the chances for everyone else to benefit from those openings as well.
Yeah, great.
And thereby on the Pacific Alliance, the importance of coordination among different, the high degree of integration among Pacific Alliance countries, the importance of integration and discussion, whether it's Chile, Peru, if you're looking at Mexico, Colombia, and others.
Listen, if you take the point that Adrienne was making, which I think is very good, a number of Latin American countries are already part of CPTPP. Chile, Mexico, and Peru. And Colombia had expressed interest in becoming part of that agreement. So, there you go in terms of trying to build different set of combinations that could deliver the kind of benefits that we're looking for.
Let me make sure we get to more questions. Please raise your hand. Take David in the third row, and then we'll take you in the second row. Microphone's coming over to you from Valentina here. Thanks, Valentina.
Thank you, David. David Lewis with Manchester Trade. Congrats to Atlantic Council, all of you, excellent report. Just curious if anyone's thinking about Latin America's repositioning now with, not just because of the trade conflict, but just reshoring from China to other markets. We're seeing it with other markets in Asia, manufacturing for export in Latin America, taking advantage of free trade agreements, U.S. companies and so on, to sort of build up on that, which didn't happen in that sort of first phase of the free trade agreements.
Thanks, David. And we'll take a question in front of you here.
Thanks a lot. Owen Churchill with the South China Morning Post. It's a question that's maybe peripheral to trade, but I think that has quite significant bearing about the Belt and Road Initiative. And obviously Xi Jinping is in Panama at the moment, and both leaders have spoken quite enthusiastically about expanding investments, infrastructural investments in that region. So I wondered maybe to Anabel what you thought about the role that BRI could play, what impact it might have on ongoing bilateral relations with countries in that region, and whether you'd agree with Pompeo's characterization, his warning that countries in that region should keep their eyes wide open when it comes to accepting money on infrastructural developments from China.
Great, thank you for both questions. We'll start with, why don't we just, I think we'll go down the row on both those questions. Annabelle, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think the point that you were making, David, is a very interesting one, because in the current context, a number of firms are looking at how to, they need to reshape their value chains, and I know certainly a couple of cases where they're looking at taking part of the production to their countries in Southeast Asia, but also Mexico is quite frequently part of that equation. So who knows? Interesting that maybe Mexico would end up being a great beneficiary of this sort of discussions between China and the U.S. So there is, I think, potential for that. On the Belt and Road Initiative, I think for Latin American countries, from the perspective of Latin American countries, the infrastructure gap in the region is huge. It is a region that is very fragmented. Geography doesn't help. And part of that will need to be financed through private investment. Part of that can come from the multilateral development banks. But part of that can also come from the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think Latin America needs to pay close attention to infrastructure building and charges related to integrity or not in the bidding procedures. But that certainly applies to China. But it also applies elsewhere, as we have seen in Latin America, which has gone through one of the, probably the largest corruption scandals related precisely to infrastructure and having nothing to do with China.
Yeah. Let me also add in, Frank, before turning to you to answer both the question on reshoring from David, but also Belt and Road. There's also a question from Twitter as well, from I think it's Bazmosky, which is, where is it in the U.S. national interest to exert pressure on the China-Latin America trade relationship? And then also, I think another elephant in the room is also, should Latin American countries view the USMCA Chapter 32 as a shot across the bow? The Chapter 32 in the USMCA is referred to as the NME clause, the non-market economy clause, which prohibits both or all USMCA trade partners from negotiating their own separate accords with China without giving prior notice to all three partners. So let me add in what the implications are of this Chapter 32 and USMCA, and maybe also how it's viewed maybe from a Chinese investment perspective, Frank, as well as the reshoring and the BRI question. Feel free to take what you want.
Yeah, actually, what I want to start with is a disclaimer. So these are the views of mine and not of the banks, because I just realized that I should have said that initially. I'm not really going to comment on some of these. I think they're questions I'm not. That's not my expertise. Yeah. But I do agree with Anabel that China's very good at navigating complex situations. But in general, I think I'll pass on a couple of these questions. All
right, so we've got four questions. I feel like this is increasing exponentially each time we go.
Choose between the interest of time. Choose between the non-market economy clause question, USMCA, as well, or Belt and Road, as
Yeah, I think, at least for the moment, we need to be careful in how much we read into the provision that's in the revisions to NAFTA, because the provision itself is characterized actually as a transparency clause. And it's one of 6 different clauses that could theoretically trigger withdrawal from the agreement. I personally am a big fan of transparency. I think this is the only instance I know of where a transparency clause is accompanied by a withdrawal possibility. And if that's going to improve transparency around the world, then interesting model to consider. But in this instance in particular, the Canadians feel very strongly this does not tie their hands. The language as it's drafted, I think, is open to interpretation about what are the nature of the agreements that are covered by it. It specifically states free trade agreements. Does that mean it's not investment agreements? Does that mean it's not tariff agreements? We don't really know on it. But really, I think the test of whether this is something to be concerned about will be whether this provision shows up in any future agreement.
Mm-hmm. Frank, let me turn to you on a question I think you will answer, what I think is an important one, is just from what you've seen at the bank, what can Latin America learn from other regions or countries that are doing business and trading with China? What have been some of the global successes that other regions have seen?
Well, I think a close cooperation with your local partners. I think that's where we've been very successful, and I also think building the infrastructure on the financial intermediation side to be able to manage your clients, to be able to provide those services which they need, which would be able to manage your RMB liquidity risk, your exposure in the various currencies, and I think that would be the best advice. And again, I look at the experience of our London and our U.S. operations. If you build it, they will come, and you'll be successful.
Anabel, let me just turn to you as the report author for the last question. I know there's other questions in the audience, and I think the panelists will stick around for a few minutes afterwards to answer your questions. But 5 years from now, what do you see? What's the trajectory of Latin America's trade and investment with China? How might it be different in 2023 than where it is today?
Well, I would like to think that Latin American countries would take advantage of this current situation in which we are right now to rethink this relationship. And I certainly think that we will see more agri-food trade between China and the U.S. I think that we will see more Chinese tourism coming to the region. Mexico is already doing, I think, a great job in bringing in Chinese tourism, and I think other countries could probably learn from that opportunity. And finally, I am very hopeful about the e-commerce potential of the region in China.
Fantastic. Well, I want to, before we end, thank some fantastic members of my team who put this together, Maria Fernanda Perez, as well as Domingo Sarduni, and welcome as well our new China Associate Director, Pepe Zhang, who's here today, his first day here, as well as thank again, Monica, thank you at HSBC for the great partnership throughout, and Jeffrey, thank you for joining us for this first conversation. Aaron, Frank, and especially Anabel, congratulations. Thank you for a great panel, and Anabel, congratulations on this fantastic report. If you didn't pick one up on the way in, please do. This will be required reading before the next time we all come together. So with that, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to the next discussion.
Thank you.